In this episode, we're going to speak about mergers. We have 5 different types of takeover transactions. How do you get control of a company? We have mergers. That's today. We have asset sales. And we covered that in a previous episode, and I'm assuming for these purposes that you've viewed that. We have tender offers. We have proxy contests. And we have share purchases. As we've discussed, you can break these down or categorize them further by putting mergers and asset sales into a bucket that we refer to as statutory. And you can put the other 3 mechanisms in the form of non-statutory, or in the category of non-statutory. And the reason for that gets back to the structure of a corporation. We have stockholders, the primary constituency, the owners, literally hold the stock of the company, but limited governance and control rights. We have the board of directors, which is the primary cohort in the governance structure. They're charged with managing the affairs of the corporation, and in that regard, they appoint and oversee and manage the officers who run the day-to-day, but the board of directors weigh in on all kinds of material and important and strategic transactions, not the least of which, or put differently, perhaps the most of which, would be mergers. The company merges into another company, or an asset sale. The company sells all or substantially all of its assets to another company. These are called statutory transactions because, dealing as we do on a default basis with Delaware law, the statute, section 251 of the Delaware General Corporation Law in the case of mergers, the statute, section 271 of the Delaware General Corporation Law in the case of asset sales, dictates that these transactions, mergers and asset sales, must be approved by the board of directors of the selling company. That makes them a statutory takeover transaction. Well, why are these other 3 called non-statutory? Well, because they don't require board approval. A proxy contest is sort of the one that's a little bit awkwardly fitting within this context because all these other transactions seem to involve the movement of real property. But a proxy contest is different. A proxy contest is essentially a political affair that goes to who's running the board of directors. And you can liken it to a political election. The Democrats want to kick out the Republicans, or the Republicans want to kick out the Democrats. If you do so, you take control of the board of directors. If you get control of the board of directors, you get to run the company. It is a takeover transaction. But it's non-statutory because you don't need the approval of the existing board of the directors to take it over. You can do it under Delaware law and then the overlay of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 as it relates to public companies in order to effect a proxy contest. Tender offers and share purchases? Well, a tender offer is really a type of share purchase. A tender offer is a highly regulated, very specific type of share purchase. But spelled out generally, a share purchase, tender offer as well, involves the sale by these stockholders of their stock to a third party. They don't need the approval of the board to do that. They just make the decision that for consideration flowing back to them, they're going to directly sell their stock to the third party. The third party will now become the stockholder. It will effect a takeover of the company that way. It's a different way of effecting a takeover, but it doesn't require the selling entity's board of directors to approve it, and as a consequence, it's considered to be a non-statutory transaction. So when speaking about mergers, it's best to start with a stock purchase transaction or a stock sale transaction. And the reason for this is it's the simplest form of share exchange and helps to tee up the balance of the conversation about mergers. So to lay out the taxonomy of our corporation a little bit differently, this is the corporation. Inside it has assets and it has liabilities. Here's our buyer. And then, of course, the company has stockholders. In a share purchase transaction, these stockholders agree to sell their stock to the buyer in exchange for some consideration. Cash, equity securities of buyer, property of another sort. The transaction is as simple as that. Perhaps the most elegant and simple takeover transaction that one could effectuate in a lab, in perfect circumstances. One of the things you'll notice is that in the aftermath, what does this look like? Well, we had 3 stockholders here, let's say, and 1 buyer here. When the dust settles and the transaction is over, our buyer now sits here as the sole stockholder, and the 3 former stockholders of seller sit over here with money in their hands. What didn't happen in this transaction? Assets and liabilities stayed the same. Stayed inside of the selling company. In fact, nothing happened with the selling company at all. All the activity took place at the stockholder level. This entity remains intact. So what does that mean? Well, think back to the asset sale conversation. If you're the buyer in an asset sale, you have the opportunity to pick and choose assets, and more importantly, you have the opportunity to pick and choose liabilities. With a stock purchase? No. With a stock purchase, you get everything. Unless you have some separate side deal by which you agree to peel something back and sell it back or hand it back, the default transactional structure, because it just takes place at the stockholder level and involves the exchange of shares, that's it, and doesn't touch this entity at all of the assets remain inside the eggshell. All of the liabilities remain inside the eggshell. No picking and choosing. That's considered to be a negative from the point of view of buyers. So if you're a buyer and you're evaluating deal structures, you remember, ooh, I like asset sales. Why? Well, because in an asset sale, I can pick and choose. In a share purchase transaction, I cannot. But of course, the other side of that coin, sellers are very attracted to this deal structure. Why? They don't have to deal with the aftermath. There's not the messy post-closing terrain where they have whatever assets were remaining, they have to figure out what to do with those. Whatever liabilities are remaining, they have to figure out how to get out from underneath those. Then they have to manage the liquidation, dissolution, and winding up of the entity. They have to crack open the eggshell, clean it up, distribute the final assets to the stockholders. It takes time, it takes energy, there's friction, there's grease, it's messy, it's costly. You don't have to deal with that. Sellers love it. Sellers love it. Two sides of the same coin. What was another point that was raised within the context of an asset sale? Step up in basis. So as it related to the assets that were transferred, conveyed, assigned from the seller to the buyer, generally speaking, in an asset sale transaction, the buyer is going to get a step up in basis. It's beneficial to them from a future depreciation perspective, from a tax perspective. There's value in that. In a share transaction, share purchase transaction, generally speaking, no step up in basis. So if these assets have been depreciated to zero in the hands of buyer, they're still at zero, no change. So you can see that from the perspective of the buyer, the share purchase transaction is almost 180 degrees on the other side of the equation from an asset sale deal structure as it relates to advantages and disadvantages. Asset sale, pick and choose, step up in basis. Share purchase, you got to take 100% and no step up in basis. So that's a big negative from the perspective of the buyer. Now we noticed, we've already discussed on the seller side, they like the fact that this is so smooth and so elegant. What about the tax issue here? We noted that in an asset sale transaction, if this is a Delaware C corporation, as we're traditionally and frequently using, or just a C corporation of any sort, there's double taxation because the transaction actually takes place within the corporation. So the selling corporation first pays tax on the gain that they were able to realize from the sale of the assets. And then once the dust settles and they settle up internally and they liquidate, dissolve, and wind up, the shareholders, the stockholders themselves, are taxed on that distribution. It's double taxation. Taxation at the level of the selling company, taxation at the level of the stockholder, if it's a C corporation. Now, if this is an S corporation, or it's a limited liability company that has elected to be taxed as a partnership or an S corporation, generally speaking, single layer of tax. So no tax at the company level, the only tax will be incurred at the shareholder level. So in the case of an asset sale, that can be devastating to the selling stockholder if it's a C corporation. Well, what about in a share purchase transaction? One layer of tax. Sale of stock. And if they qualify, if they've held the stock long enough, it's long-term capital gains. If they've held the stock for a short period of time, it's short-term capital gains. But regardless, whether or not they have long-term capital gains or short-term capital gains treatment, one layer of tax in a share purchase transaction. So to roll that back and to recap, if you have a C corporation seller and you do an asset deal, 2 levels of tax. If you have a C corporation seller and you do a share purchase transaction, 1 layer of tax. Huge advantage for the seller from a tax perspective when you're talking about a share purchase versus an asset deal. Now, small caveat, a little footnote I should say, that advantage is a little bit diminished if our seller is a pass-through entity, because in an asset deal, 1 layer of tax, share purchase transaction, 1 layer of tax. So there are going to be some mild differences between from a tax perspective, but it's a little bit more of a push. So we can see how an asset deal versus a share purchase transaction has got some pros and cons. What was something else that we mentioned as it related to asset deals? We talked about assignment clauses. And we talked about how this was a burden to both buyers and sellers alike, because inevitably there are commercial contracts or agreements of other sorts that are critical to the business of seller that buyer wants. And in order to acquire those contracts, in order to assume those contracts, in order to have those contracts assigned from seller to buyer, we need to ensure that those contracts are assignable one way or the other. And we noted that in the event that the contract is silent, it's freely assignable. That's great, but that's unusual. A blanket prohibition on assignment would simply say neither party can assign this agreement without the consent of the other. So if there's an important contract here that needs to make its way to buyer and it's an asset deal, you're going to have to get the consent of the counterparty to that agreement. So with assignment clauses, they run the spectrum, and if there's no assignment clause at all, the contract itself doesn't speak to an assignment, it's freely assignable. Great, but that doesn't happen very often. There, of course, is the other extreme where the basic contract reads, this agreement is not assignable without the consent of the other party. That means for us to get that agreement from the seller to the buyer, we need to go out and affirmatively get the consent of the third party, the other party to that contract. There's something in between which says this agreement is not assignable without the consent of the other party unless the assignment is taking place or within the context of a sale of all or substantially all the assets of the company, which basically allows for free assignability. But the point is you have to look and you have to be extremely attentive to these assignment or anti-assignment provisions if you're doing an asset deal, and buyer and seller alike need to pay close attention to that and manage that process with great care and great attention and probably a fair amount of effort and work. Well, what about in a share purchase transaction? Irrelevant. Why? Because the contracts don't leave. There's no assignment. The entity continues to exist. Nothing changes. The assets stay, the liabilities stay, and within that, all those agreements stay. So a huge lift, a huge part of the effort of selling a company, or a business, I should say, within the context of an asset deal is just completely off the table when it comes to a share purchase. So think about that. With an asset deal, you've got the headache of cleaning up the selling entity post-closing and then managing its dissolution and all the activity associated with that, headache. And you have the assignment issues, headache. Neither of those apply in the case of a share purchase. Okay, so we've walked through pushing the pros and cons back and forth, and you can see that it's almost binary, black and white, left, right, between share purchase transactions and asset sale transactions. What's good on the one hand with one is not in the other, and vice versa. Well, what about the final piece with asset deals? We mentioned that in asset transactions, the stockholders do not have, the selling stockholders do not have appraisal rights. And we're going to talk about those more in the context of mergers here in a few minutes, because the stockholders of the seller in a merger transaction do have appraisal rights, but they do not in an asset deal. And the reason for that is because the merger represents the conversion or the disposition of the stock in the hands of seller. And appraisal rights themselves, sometimes called dissenters' rights, can be activated by those stockholders of seller who don't want to do the deal, but they can't block it. And as a consequence, they get appraisal rights. They get the opportunity to work a process by which they can receive what they think is fair value for those shares, which they don't believe is taking place in the transaction itself. And again, they get those appraisal rights because something is happening with their stock and they're being forced into this transaction against their will. In an asset deal, appraisal rights don't exist for a variety of reasons. But the primary reason why they don't exist is that it's not a sale of stock. There are stockholders of the selling company. The company is selling the assets and liabilities, and then through a liquidating situation is pushing those proceeds out to the selling stockholders. But the selling stockholders aren't actually selling their shares. So there's not the sense of a disposition of shares against their will. In a share purchase transaction, you're not going to have appraisal rights because you don't need appraisal rights. Share purchase transactions only work if the shareholder voluntarily is selling their shares to the buyer. Now, that's a place where you could say asset deals and share purchase transactions are a push. Neither of them have appraisal rights. If you do an asset deal, appraisal rights for selling stockholders? No. If you do a share purchase transaction, appraisal rights for selling stockholders? No. Okay, so that's just a neutral factor. Well, it is and it isn't. Because what it does is it shines light on the biggest impediment to share purchase transactions from a logistical perspective. So there are other reasons why buyers in particular may not want to do a share purchase. They have to take everything and no step up in basis. But there's a reason why even sellers who love the elegance of pushing everything over in one fell swoop and who love the single layer of tax, even a seller might say, we can't even try to negotiate for a share purchase transaction because it's just not feasible. And why would that be? Because you would think from the seller's perspective, this is the perfect transaction. All the assets and liabilities, one fell swoop over to buyer. They single layer tax on the transaction. Great. They don't have to worry about the assignment clauses or anti-assignment clauses. Fantastic. No appraisal rights. Super. Well, the fundamental issue is this. It's because each of these people get to make a decision. And if buyers are comfortable acquiring less than 100% of the stock of the selling company, perhaps it's a little bit more feasible. But in most takeover transactions of this sort, buyers are looking to acquire 100% of the business. In a share purchase transaction, the only way they can acquire 100% is if they buy 100% of the shares. Now, if you have one shareholder or two shareholders or three shareholders, that's doable. But 4, 5, 1,000 shareholders, 2,000 shareholders, 3,000 shareholders, you just can't do it. It's not feasible. There's no way that you're going to be able to circle up and get unanimity and get all of these people to agree to sell their shares. So in some privately held contexts where the seller is a privately held entity and there are just a handful of shareholders who are pretty well aligned, a share purchase transaction is very viable. The buyer may object for other reasons, but seller can certainly push it, and it's there as an alternative. But if you're dealing with an entity, a selling entity with a lot of stockholders, and what I'm really talking about here is a publicly traded company, a public company, a share purchase transaction just isn't feasible. So, notwithstanding all of the advantages of a share purchase transaction from the perspective of seller, if your seller has a ton of stockholders, which is virtually always the case with a public company, if you have a public company seller, you're not going to be able to do a share purchase transaction. Now, in theory, you could still do an asset deal, right? Because an asset deal doesn't require unanimity at the stockholder level. It requires a stockholder vote under Section 271, but the default rule is it requires the consent of a majority of interest or a majority in interest of the stockholders. Now, that's great, right? Because you don't need unanimity and you can get away with a majority in interest. So even if you have a lot of stockholders, you can pull off an asset sale so long as you can circle up the support of a majority in interest. Well, that's true. And so in theory, when we're looking at a public company seller, share purchase is off the table, but an asset purchase perhaps is on the table. Well, the reality is it's really not. And it's not for a sister reason. It goes to the complexity of public companies. With share purchase transactions, the complexity is at the stockholder level. There are just a lot of them. And it's hard to herd all those cats. What's the complexity in the asset purchase context? Assets and liabilities. There are a lot of them. And the feasibility of winding your way through that and working your way through that process and separating the wheat from the chaff and going through assignment clauses and whatnot and doing it within the context of a public company, which by definition is probably going to be a company with some heft. It's extraordinarily difficult. It's an inefficiency and an expansion of effort, which is out of proportion to the transaction itself. So when you're dealing with a really large and complex private company, and when you're dealing with a public company in almost every context, an asset sale is off the table. So we have lots of pros and cons that we've been talking about an asset sale versus a share purchase, and those come into play when you have a smaller privately held company. But if we have a big and complicated privately held seller or a publicly held seller, can't do a share purchase transaction, can't do an asset deal either. So what are we left with? A merger. So let's talk about a merger. So when we're talking about a merger transaction, it's easy to take them for granted because they're so prevalent in the transactional world, and particularly since the late 1800s, they're a very common form of takeover transaction. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we sort of made these things up. This notion of two becoming one doesn't exist in nature. It's not sort of a logical outgrowth of a certain philosophy or school of economics or way of viewing the world. It was something that was created out of convenience and out of need, and we made it up, and we created the legal architecture to support it. And it's also reasonable to note that there are countries in the world where there's no such thing as a merger. It's just not part of their legal architecture, their framework. It's not available as a door number 3 for a form of transaction. And so, like limited liability, which is something we made up, which is critically important to the facilitation of commerce, mergers, also made up, are incredibly important in the takeover transactional world. So don't lose sight of that and keep an eye on that. Now, what's happening in a merger transaction? Well, we start with our selling entity again, and our selling entity has assets and liabilities inside of it, right? Just like every company does. And just like an entity does that's selling its business through an asset deal or selling itself, its shares, through a share purchase transaction, okay? Now, for purposes of nomenclature and terminology, a lot of times when we're dealing with an asset deal, because the selling entity is the entity itself, and it's involved in that transaction and there's a sale, we refer to it as the seller. In the context of a merger, usually the language used is target. So we're going to start to use that language here. Now you can use this language, of course, in the context of a share purchase transaction or an asset deal. It's fine. Because it's fair. This is the target company with the target business that the buyer is interested in. But in the merger context, you'll see that that's the terminology used all the time. So this is our target. And of course, our target has stockholders as well, right? The owners of the business. And then we have a buyer who sits over here. Now, what we know is that if we're doing an asset deal, we're going to sell all or substantially all the assets to buyer. We're going to transfer some or maybe none of the liabilities to buyer. Buyer is going to send consideration back. We're going to clean this up. We're going to liquidate, dissolve, and wind up and push everything out to the stockholders. If this is a share purchase transaction, the transaction is actually not taking place between buyer and target or buyer and selling entity. The transaction is taking place between buyer and the selling stockholders. Stock to buyer, buyer delivers the consideration directly to the stockholders. In a merger transaction, we don't have that kind of clear directional exchange. This is the magic of a merger transaction. Assets and liabilities in exchange for consideration. Stock in exchange for consideration. What's happening here? Well, two things are happening simultaneously. First of all, these shares are not being exchanged. They're not being transferred. They're converted into the right to receive consideration from the buyer. And this language is important. They're not exchanged for consideration. They're not sold for consideration. That's a share purchase transaction. It's a sale of shares. That's not what's happening here. They are converted into the right to receive consideration from buyer. And what's happening simultaneously? What's happening is this entity, the target entity itself, disappears because it's absorbed completely by buyer. So all those assets and all those liabilities end up inside a buyer. And that red circle is a little bit misleading because it doesn't go in as a separate entity. The assets and the liabilities just go in and become part of buyer. And the language that we use is that these assets and liabilities are vested, and this becomes important, in buyer. So the transaction, the magic is, target disappears. Its assets and liabilities are vested magically in buyer, and this stock in Target that was held by the stockholders of Target is converted into the right to receive consideration. All of this is articulated within a group of related documents. You've got a plan of merger, the merger agreement, which lays all of this out and all of these terms out. And frankly, from a substantive perspective and a terminology perspective and an architectural perspective, as we will discuss more, looks very similar, frankly, to an asset purchase agreement and a share purchase agreement. Those documents are quite similar. But we're going to use some different terminology like conversion and vesting. But more importantly, from the point of differentiation, this merger is actually made effective. It's actually consummated not simply by signing a merger agreement or signing a plan of merger between the parties, but you have to file, you have to make a filing with the implicated secretaries of state. So if buyer is a Delaware corporation and Target is a Delaware corporation, we will file a certificate of merger in Delaware and be done. If Target is a Delaware corporation, certificate of merger gets filed. If buyer is in a different state, it's probably called articles of merger, and that gets filed in that state. When those filings are made, then the merger is declared effective, and it just happens magically. That's different than an asset deal. That's different than a share purchase, because this is more transformational than those transactions. And as a consequence, because we literally have the elimination of an entity, we have a public filing that declares that this happened and what happened. Now, conversion is important because it makes it clear that this wasn't an exchange or a sale. It just turns into something else. Why is the word vested important? Well, it's important because it doesn't involve the use of the word assigned. So you will recall in an asset deal, one of the headaches is that we have to wrestle with the assignment of contracts from seller or target to buyer. In a merger, and this is called, by the way, this variation of a merger is called a forward merger. In this forward merger, all the assets and all the liabilities of Target are vested in buyer. They become the property of buyer. They are held by buyer, and of course, that includes all these contracts. They are not assigned to buyer. So, if a commercial agreement is silent on assignment, of course it's freely assignable and it doesn't matter. It moves over regardless, no problem. But what if there's a blanket prohibition? What if the agreement says this agreement cannot be assigned without the consent of the other party to the agreement? Well, we know in an asset deal, it's triggered, and you've got to go get the consent of that third party. But that's not the case here. It's not an assignment. It's vested. And generally speaking, the law recognizes that as not being an assignment. It's just a different kind of forward motion. Now, You may think to yourself, that seems idiosyncratic. And you'd be right. And of course, other parties have too. We've been doing mergers for a long time. And there's a workaround. And the workaround that you will find in many commercial agreements is this. This agreement cannot be assigned by operation of law or otherwise without the consent of the other party hereto. This agreement cannot be assigned by operation of law or otherwise without the consent of the other party. Why do we have that language? We don't need it for an asset deal. This agreement cannot be assigned without the consent of the other party. That's enough. So this agreement must be doing something. It is. It's picking up forward mergers. In virtually all cases and jurisdictions, that language is interpreted to mean that this by operation of law or otherwise means vesting. That in the event of a forward merger, this is a kind of assignment. I want to be careful. It's not an assignment, but you get my drift. The agreement is moving with the assets and liabilities. We can call it vesting, but it's moving. There's a sense that it's changing. And as a consequence, that is an assignment by operation of law. We can use a different word, but that's a way of picking it up. So the point of all of that is to say that if you're doing a merger transaction, you've not escaped these assignment clauses to the same extent that you have with a share purchase agreement or a share purchase transaction. You need to go and see if it says by operation of law or otherwise, because if it does, you need to go get the consent of that other party. So you've got the elegance of a share purchase, but there's still some extra work. And let's keep sharpening that point a little bit. The elegance of what? Well, like a share purchase transaction, all the assets and all the liabilities move from target to buyer. There's no picking and choosing. So if you're the buyer and you want to pick and choose assets and you want to pick and choose liabilities, you're limited to an asset deal. You can't do a share purchase transaction because they just stay inside target. And you can't do a merger because they all move over. And of course, that's the attraction to the seller, right? In a share purchase transaction, all those assets and liabilities stay in the target company that you now no longer hold stock in. Fine, they stay behind. You don't need to fool with it. Same with the merger transaction. Everything moves over. That's to great benefit of the selling stockholders. They don't need to fool with it. So we have talked about assignment. We have talked about deal efficiency. Let's talk about tax. We mentioned that in an asset deal, buyer gets step up in basis in the assets. You don't get that in a share purchase transaction. We also mentioned that in an asset deal, if we have a C corporation target, double taxation. Whereas in a share purchase transaction, single layer of tax. What happens in a forward merger? Again, we have to be careful when we're talking about tax at a high level, but it's important to have some basic fluency in the basic concepts. Generally speaking, a forward merger is treated as an asset deal, which means step up in basis for the buyer. They like that, but 2 layers of tax for the target stockholders. Not so crazy about that. So it's sort of an interesting hybrid transactional model, isn't it? In that there are pieces of what happens in a share purchase that feel good for seller, but there are pieces of what shows up in an asset deal that feel bad for seller, and both show up with a merger, and same for the buyer. So the tax characterization is tricky. The administrative process is tricky. we have this interesting language, which is fun. I hope you think so. So what does that leave? Well, it leaves the approvals and some of these governance issues with this overlay of appraisal rights that I mentioned, and let's hit that a little harder. So share purchase deals are non-statutory. I'm a stockholder, I agree to sell my stock to buyer, we make an exchange, we're done. An asset deal is statutory. Section 271 of the Delaware General Corporation Law. Target board, seller board, needs to approve it, and so do the stockholders, a majority in interest. Mergers, because they directly involve the change of the character of the stock. This was a property interest that you have in an entity that through legal machinations has now been changed to be something else. Originally, there was this notion that that's so profound and that's so organic that, like a share purchase transaction, we need unanimity. Okay? And that makes some sense. I made a personal decision to acquire these shares of stock, and if you're going to change this pen into a pencil, or this bicycle into a motorcycle, I should have some say. But over time, we realized that that was very inefficient. Because, recall, share purchase transactions really only work when you have a small number of shareholders because they require unanimity. If you have a large, complicated, privately held company or a public company, lots of stockholders, it's hard to pull off a share purchase transaction because it's hard to get unanimity. Same with a merger. Law recognized it, law loosened up, became 2/3, and now in most jurisdictions, it's some version of a majority. In Delaware, it's a majority in interest. Now, you can change that in the certificate of incorporation. You can up the ante a little bit. If you want it to be 2/3, you can. Most don't. So you need a majority in interest of the stockholders. But there was a notion that said, look, we're okay with having this be a majority in interest in the asset transactional environment because these corporations are dealing in their assets and liabilities all the time. And by the way, the party to the transaction is actually the entity, not the stockholders. We're not really directly impacting the selling stockholder stock. That stays in place until the company actually liquidates. Share purchase transaction, you have to have unanimity. That's the only way that it works. But what do we do about these stockholders of Target that vote against the merger transaction, but yet are dragged along? Because the statute doesn't say unanimity, it says majority in interest. So what do we do about those stockholders? Do we feel comfortable with that? Is it okay for them to be dragged along? And we reached the conclusion that it was, that we didn't want to put loaded guns in all of their hands and give everyone essentially a veto right. The transaction must be allowed to take place. But we felt like there should be an outlet. And you'll recall hearkening back to the discussion on choice of entity and entity analysis and how there was a lot of concern over generations about the separation of ownership and control within the context of corporations, and specifically the endowment and the expansion of the concept of limited liability. And do we perhaps lose some pressure on the managers if they aren't, I should be more specific, on owner managers if they're not subject to unlimited liability? And we ultimately felt like over time that was okay. And one of the ways we got there was through this notion of fiduciary duties, that we would create this legal concept that these actors in the business of the company are subject to fiduciary duties. So they may not have unlimited liability by virtue of being owners as they once did, but they still have the duty to behave in a responsible way. And that was the way we got comfortable with that. And I'm going back to speak to that because I'm using that by an analogy here. We are comfortable with the notion of dragging people along, but we feel like we need to have an extra outlet for them. So fiduciary duties represent that outlet when we're talking about separation of ownership and control, and when we're talking about the expansion of limited liability within the corporate form. Appraisal rights, or dissenter's rights, represent that here in the merger context. And basically what happens with appraisal rights is that the target stockholders who dissent, who don't support the transaction, have the opportunity to petition the court to get fair value for their shares. So when you actually engage in the merger transaction, it's only the shares of the non-dissenting target stockholders that convert into the right to receive consideration. The shares of the dissenting stockholders don't convert. They hang out there, and they need to work through the judicial process. So appraisal rights are a fairly significant overhang and drag on the merger transaction. What's interesting is that not only do target stockholders have appraisal rights, but buyer stockholders have appraisal rights. Why? Well, we've not paid much attention to this thus far, but in the context of a merger, not only must target board and target stockholders support the transaction, but buyer board and buyer stockholders must support the transaction. And there's a sense that a merger is so transformational to buyer that not only must its stockholders have a say in it, the dissenting stockholders should have appraisal rights as well. Very interesting. While we're on the topic, what's happening with the buyer in these other forms of transactions? In an asset deal, the board of buyer must approve the transaction, but the stockholders need not. So not only do the stockholders, well, you just don't have appraisal rights anywhere in an asset deal. But if we're talking about an asset deal, we're talking about seller board, seller stockholders, buyer board, buyer stockholders aren't involved at all. It's even simpler with a share purchase transaction. Buyer is just buying the shares of the selling stockholders. Nothing is happening on the approval basis on the seller side. Nothing is happening at the level of the buyer stockholders. If the transaction is material enough, you're going to need the buyer board to approve it, and most of the time it's going to be. So the buyer board will approve this transaction, but there aren't stockholder votes taking place. But in the context of a merger, target board, target stockholders, buyer board, buyer stockholders, and appraisal rights on both sides of the equation. Significant overhang and a significant drag and potential risk to the transaction. So this is the forward merger. Now, one of the elements of this or several elements of this to consider and to think about. One is getting buyer stockholders to approve the transaction can be cumbersome. Because remember, we discussed that share purchases don't really work for complex private company and certainly for public company transactions because there are too many stockholders. And asset deals don't really work because there are too many assets, too many liabilities, there's too much stuff. So we're left with mergers. So if we want to do a takeover transaction that's structured as a literal ownership change of the business, we have to have a merger. Okay? So if we're dealing with a target company that's a public company, chances are the buyer is public too. Not always, but oftentimes. I mean, typically the buyer is the bigger fish, and if the target is so large that it's a public company, buyer probably is too. Going out and getting buyer stockholder approval when buyer is a public company is a headache, okay? And there is just an administrative hassle to going out and soliciting that approval. So that's an issue. How can we get out from underneath that? What else is an issue? Appraisal rights. Buyer stockholders have appraisal rights. That's a pain. It'd be nice to not have to wrestle with that. All these stockholders out there, we give them a chance to maybe exercise their angst in a way that we're not comfortable with or excited about. And then finally, from a limitation of liability perspective, you may be picking up on something that's interesting with a merger transaction, that all of these assets and liabilities end up inside a buyer. Well, what if one of these liabilities in particular turns out to be terribly hairy, expensive? Well, you've got these assets from the target to help satisfy that. I guess that's a good thing. But you know what else? The buyer has other assets, and those other assets are at risk. So, in other words, a buyer who's considering a forward merger has to think about complexities relating to their stockholders, and they also have to think about liability exposure. Now, it's not that this doesn't exist in the context of an asset sale, right? We talked about buyer acquiring assets and acquiring liabilities, but it's mitigated in the context of an asset sale because at least there's some volition, there's some intentionality. Buyer can be very particular about the liabilities they take and the liabilities they leave behind. Even still, in an asset deal, buyer may be extra concerned about what they're taking on, and it wouldn't be uncommon to see buyers set up an acquisition sub. What does this mean? They just set up a different entity, wholly owned, and instead of the assets and the liabilities being acquired directly by buyer, the assets and liabilities are acquired by the acquisition sub. So if there is a hairy liability, an expensive liability, a liability that bleeds, that's radioactive, yes, these assets are at risk, but that's it. The other assets and liabilities of a buyer are not at risk. Why? Because it's a stockholder. It enjoys limited liability. It's that firewall that we've learned about and that we're familiar with. So this is not an uncommon deal structure in the asset purchase environment. In the share purchase environment, this is what happens anyway, because the acquisition sub isn't really a sub you've set up. That's the target, and here's the buyer, because they just bought the stock directly from the stockholders. So you've already isolated assets and liabilities in a sub. So targets will frequently do this out of convenience, even though they do have a little bit more ability to limit exposure by picking and choosing liabilities. Share purchase transactions end up with this multi-level structure just by virtue of the exchange of shares. Is there anything we can do in the merger context? And of course, as you can tell by my tone, the answer is yes, of course there is. And this is where we get into something called subsidiary mergers or triangular mergers. And this is the kind of jargon that might cause your head to explode a little bit, but will make you highly entertaining at cocktail parties, at least the cocktail parties that I go to, which may not be the cocktail parties that you want to go to. So how does this work? Well, let's get back to our basic structure. Here's our target. And our target has assets and liabilities, right? And we have target stockholders who live up here, and then we have buyer who lives over here, and of course buyer has stockholders too. Let's go ahead and add them since we've overlaid that complexity. Now, if we were to do a forward merger, all of these assets and liabilities are vested in buyer. These shares of target stockholders convert into the right to receive consideration. And now buyer is exposed to all these liabilities And by the way, they also need the vote of buyer stockholders, and dissenting buyer stockholders have appraisal rights. Well, there's a workaround. And the workaround is just what we described in the other deal structure context, is you set up an acquisition sub. And what happens here? Well, the assets and the liabilities move from target to the acquisition sub. Target, of course, disappears, and the shares of target convert into the right to receive whatever consideration has been outlined. It's a forward merger. Forward merger. But it's a forward triangular merger, or a forward subsidiary merger. Why? Because we're using a subsidiary, and it's triangular because we have 3 entities involved. It's forward because now we're going to get into a little bit more nomenclature as it relates to a merger. In a merger, the entity that disappears is called the disappearing entity, or the disappearing corporation. And the entity that survives, that continues, is called the surviving corporation, or the survivor. In a forward merger, it's very straightforward. Target is the disappearing corporation. The buyer is the surviving corporation. In a forward triangular merger, the acquisition sub is the surviving corporation, and the target is the disappearing corporation. So what have we done here? What have we accomplished here that's different from a traditional forward merger? Well, we've isolated the assets and the liabilities of target in this acquisition sub. We've protected, we've insulated the other assets and liabilities of buyer from that risk. We can do that in an asset deal, number one, because we can be more careful and intentional about the liabilities that we assume. We can't do that in a merger, we get them all. But in an asset deal, we will still sometimes set up these acquisition subs to provide this kind of insulation. And we know that in a share purchase transaction, it sort of happens automatically. Here, again, like an asset deal, we're using intentionality to build some protection in there. But we've done something else that's really cute. Remember the issue we have with buyer stockholders? They get a vote and they get appraisal rights. Well, if we have a buyer that's a big public company, getting through that process is a pretty significant obstacle. It's no small undertaking to solicit that approval and then to deal with the potential of those appraisal rights. But who are the buyer stockholders here? The buyer, the surviving entity, is actually the sub. That's the stockholder. So for purposes of Delaware General Corporation Law, when we're thinking about the stockholders who have certain rights, we're now getting more specific, and we're not really talking about buyer stockholders per se, we're talking about the stockholders of the surviving corporation. In a forward merger, it's really one and the same, right? Because we just have this buyer entity, and these buyer stockholders are the stockholders of the surviving entity. But here, the stockholder of the surviving entity is just the buyer. So we look to this entity, the big fish, one stockholder for purposes of voting and approval, and as a consequence, there's not going to be appraisal rights because they're going to vote for it. We're going to get 100% approval, okay, one vote, because there's only one stockholder. So we eliminate all the complexity of dealing with those ultimate stockholders because we've worked this through the sub, and the law doesn't drive us all the way through to these ultimate stakeholder stockholders. It respects the nomenclature, and the nomenclature is these stockholders of the surviving corporation. And that's buyer. So we've insulated ourselves from an assets and specifically a liabilities perspective. And we've really gone a long ways through creative deal structuring to avoid these sorts of complexities with votes and appraisal rights. Now, we still have to deal with votes and appraisal rights of target stockholders, and we're never getting out from underneath that, with a few exceptions that we'll get to another time. But in the vast majority of cases, we don't. But what else are we looking at and what else is in play? Well, okay, all the assets and liabilities have moved over. We've got that transactional efficiency. We like that. What about the tax issue? Well, it's forward. So when you hear forward, you should think asset deal. For tax purposes, generally speaking, this is treated as an asset deal. So buyer gets to step up in basis. That's a good thing. They get to enjoy the tax benefit of this future depreciation. But unfortunately, if we're dealing with a target that's a C corporation, and we probably are, double taxation. And that's a hard hit. What about contracts? Same thing as a forward merger. They're not assigned, they vest, but if that by operation of law language is there, it gets picked up too. So a forward triangular merger or a forward subsidiary merger tracks the pros and cons of the forward merger pretty closely, except it cleverly helps us to avoid dealing with these ultimate stakeholders, and it provides some nice insulation from a liability perspective. But we're still wrestling with this vesting issue, are we not? This whole notion of how do we move these contracts over? And this is such a headache. And I thought the whole reason that we couldn't do an asset deal with a public company was because of the hassle of moving all these things around. But we're using mergers in this context. How is that working? And by the way, this asset tax treatment, while the buyer likes it, it's pretty devastating for selling stockholders. So we're still really at the short end of the stick. So what we're really trying to do, if you want to boil it down, if you were to say to yourself, if I were to come up with a transaction structure that feels like it's the best of all worlds, or if that's too high a bar, the best of many worlds, what we might start with is we might look at a share purchase transaction. And we might say, what do we like about a share purchase transaction? We like that we have target and the assets and the liabilities live here. And we like that all the activity is happening at the stockholder level. Target stockholders sell their stock, exchange their stock with buyer in exchange for consideration. Buyer ends up being the sole stockholder. Buyer gets insulation from those liabilities. That's a pretty good thing. Seller, of course, is the big winner in this. Single layer of tax, transactional efficiency, all those assets and liabilities move over. Buyer, of course, loses the step up in basis, doesn't get that benefit. And we do get to escape these assignment or anti-assignment clauses because these contracts never move. Now, this looks a lot like where we ended up with a forward triangular merger, except it was actually the acquisition sub that ended up as the ultimate sub of buyer, which meant we had to deal with the motion and the movement and the vesting and the operation of law stuff, and it was taxed as an asset sale. So pretty close to this, but not quite there. Is there a deal structure that would be treated as a stock sale, single layer of tax? And is there a deal structure that would get us out of this operation of law language? And the answer is there is. And it too results in the target surviving. So that the end is the buyer owning a wholly owned subsidiary, which is Target. So you end up in the same place that you end up with a share purchase transaction, but it's a merger, which means you can effectuate it even in a complicated context. How in the world does this work? Well, it's the coolest deal structure that, obviously unbiased, that we will work with, and it is what's called a reverse merger, specifically a reverse triangular merger or a reverse subsidiary merger. We have our target with assets and liabilities. The target has stockholders. We have our buyer. Our buyer, of course, has stockholders. We set up the acquisition sub. Now, in a forward triangular merger, the acquisition sub survives. All of the assets and liabilities move into the acquisition sub, or absorbed into it, or vested into it, and is treated as an asset sale. With a reverse triangular merger, target survives. So in the end, what happens is buyer owns target, target survives, the acquisition sub is the disappearing entity. It merges with and into the target. So just like with a forward triangular merger, the activity is happening at this level. We are having a merger between target and acquisition sub. If it's a forward merger, acquisition sub survives. If it's a reverse, the target entity survives. And of course, that means the acquisition sub disappears. Well, what does that do for us? What's the benefit of a reverse triangular merger over a forward triangular merger, perhaps besides sounding a little fancier? Well, first things first, let's keep in mind that we still get the benefit of not having to deal with the complexity of the ultimate stakeholders. We don't need their vote, and they don't get appraisal rights, because this is our stockholder, the buyer. Okay? Now, another thing that we avoid is we avoid this vesting issue because they're not moving in the same way. We'll still say that the assets and the liabilities vest in the surviving entity, but the surviving entity is the target. So they haven't moved. It's like a share purchase transaction. They've stayed in place. Yes, they've vested, but it's sort of just a recognition of what is just already the case. And as a consequence, not only is that not an assignment, it's not an assignment by operation of law. So just like a share purchase transaction gets to avoid those assignment or anti-assignment clauses, with respect to a reverse triangular merger, you get to avoid it as well. Because even the operation of law language doesn't pick it up. It picks up forward triangular mergers, it picks up forward mergers, but it doesn't pick up reverse triangular mergers. And then, as importantly, perhaps more importantly, from a tax perspective, it's treated as a stock sale. Now that's not great for buyer. They don't get the step up in basis, so they lose that tax benefit. But it's incredibly beneficial for the target stockholders. So just like in the choice of entity context, where you would never say, for all businesses, for all time, there's one single choice to make. It's circumstantial. And of course, there are generalizations within certain categories. If you're a tech or a biotech or a life sciences startup, Delaware C Corporation. If you're a small business, owner-operated, Probably an S corporation or an LLC that elects to be taxed as an S corporation. Maybe an LLC that elects to be taxed as a partnership if you have different sorts of stockholders. If you're organizing as a sophisticated venture capital firm, you're going to organize as a limited partnership. These sorts of things vary based on circumstance. Deal structures vary based on circumstance. Buyers, let's just knock out a couple of them. Buyers love asset deals. They love the step up in basis. They love to pick and choose assets and liabilities. But it's just not viable if you're dealing with a public company seller. Just too much stuff to deal with, to categorize, to schedule, to inventory. You're going to need to move down the path of a merger transaction. You may also run into resistance if the tax issue is going to be incredibly devastating to the selling stockholders, which would happen if the target, if the seller, is a C corporation, because there are two levels of tax. So buyer may show up and say, I want to do an asset deal. Seller says we can't because we're public, and or we can't because the tax impact, while good for you, is going to be devastating for us, and it's going to be such a drag on the total proceeds that we just can't get there acquisitionally. So you're going to look for a different form. You might look to a share purchase, but under this scenario, probably doesn't work because the scenario I just described is probably too hairy, too large, too big, too complicated for a share purchase, so you're going to be looking at a merger. Within a merger, you could go the forward route or the forward triangular route, but we just said the tax issue is a real problem in that context because our target is a C corporation. So what are you going to do? You're going to go with a reverse subsidiary merger or a reverse triangular merger in that context. Buyer gives a little bit up, the seller gets a lot. And it's a transaction that you can pull off and get done. So in that kind of a context, you're going to go with that. Now, obviously we do asset deals. When do we do asset deals? When we do asset deals with smaller companies, and we do asset deals with pass-through entities, when the target is an S corporation or the target is an LLC that's elected to be taxed as a partnership or an S corporation, there, the tax impact isn't as devastating to the seller, and as a consequence, they may be more open to doing that kind of transaction with the buyer because it's so advantageous for the buyer, and this all gets sorted out in deal structure and purchase price. If you're dealing with an entity with lots of commercial contracts, you may have trouble doing an asset deal no matter what. It's complicated. If you have an entity that's got lots of stockholders, you're going to have trouble doing a share purchase transaction because by definition it requires unanimity. So the point is these are all dials. They're levers. They're slides that we push back and forth. We never walk around and say we can only do mergers or we can only do reverse triangular mergers. We never walk around and say we can only do asset deals, or we can never do asset deals, or we can only do share purchase deals, or we can never do forward mergers. That's not the case. There's a time and a place for all of these. But the important thing to keep in mind is that you need to understand what are the buttons, what sort of facts are we looking at, and what's going to drive deal structure issues. And we've covered those in this session, and hopefully as you walk away from this, you'll have a better appreciation for how to overlay our thinking, our analysis, as we approach those sorts of issues. And it will allow you, within the context of a specific deal, to make the right guess. And not just the right guess, to offer the right counsel and to make the right choice as it goes to deal structure in a way that optimizes the outcome to the best you can for all the parties involved.